Okay. Funny joke number one. You ready? What type of dinosaur does things really quickly? What kind of dinosaur does things really quickly? A brontosaurus. Okay. How about this one? What does one house say to the other? How's it going? Okay. Last one. You guys ready for the last one? Last one of the semester? Or should we do jokes next week as well? All right, we'll do jokes. So it's not the last one. It's almost the last one. What happens when you eat yeast and shoe polish? And shoe polish. Yeast and shoe polish. You rise and shine. Okay. Wow. Tough crowd. I like hand selected those three. I thought they were really good. Alright. Back in the back of the deck. So, in our last lecture, it's one of my favorite topics. I've spent quite a bit of time within the cardiovascular field. My experience has been pretty vast within cardiovascular bioengineering and physiology. A significant component of my dissertation was actually cardiovascular phys. And so, do you guys remember the dreaded Wigger's diagram from 202? Right? It's the one that had all of the lines kind of superimposed over each other, and there's hard sounds with lub-dub, and you look at pressures falling and rising, and volumes falling and rising. So I had studied that thing ad nauseum, essentially, right? And in my condo in grad school, we had this monster whiteboard, almost this big, I would say. And you can buy this stuff at Home Depot. And so we kind of had made our own, and we would study on that and draw out these diagrams. And I think that drawing it out, which is what we're going to start with, drawing it out is probably one of the best ways to kind of figure out how things move through the cardiovascular system. We're not going to rehash the Wigger's diagram, but it's probably not a bad thing to go look at again if you're a little bit rusty on it. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to kind of start with perfusion. So after during grad school, I kind of developed this technology that I had started my research looking at one of the questions of what's considered a holy grail within cardiovascular physiology and cardiac medicine. One of my Ph.D. advisors, I had 5 committee members. So in grad school, the way it works, if you get a master's degree, you usually have 3 advisors on your committee. With a Ph.D., you usually have 5. So what that means, you have to convince 5 people that you've done enough work to actually move on. So it's kind of one of the most unique types of training in the world, right? I mean, it's not like you just take an exam, you get a score, and it's like, yeah, you passed. You have 5 individuals, and think of 5 professors. How likely is it if you ask them a question like, why is the sky blue? You're going to get the 5 exact answers. Okay? So in of itself, it's kind of an interesting educational process to get a doctorate or a Ph.D. in a classic science like that. Well, one of my advisors was a heart surgeon, or is a heart surgeon. He was a heart surgeon then, he still is. And Dr. Arzuman was a cardiothoracic surgeon. So I spent a lot of time with him in the human OR, watching what the issues were. And the way that I wanted to do my training was I wanted to go into a medical field and watch where there were problems and then try to figure out a solution for that problem. So I started out researching cabbage grafts. It stands for coronary artery bypass grafting, CABG. And cabbage grafts usually harvested from a saphenous vein in the leg, or you might take the internal mammary artery that feeds the mammary tissue. And if it's the vein in the leg, then you usually have to turn it around and cut out the one-way valves. The mammary artery is already an artery, so there's no valves in it. And he would sew those in, and I would actually scrub in with him and kind of be able to assist. And he would tell me, we're gonna get maybe 7 to 10 years out of this. I was like, and then what? Well, then we got. Then what do? Then we go to the other leg. Well, what if the disease in the other leg is bad? He's like, aha. And then we have to go to like cadavers, or we go to synthetic tubes. But the problem with synthetic tubes is when you get down to a coronary artery, they're about 3 millimeters in internal diameter. They're really, really tiny. And so they coagulate really quick. So I thought, okay, I'm going to solve the world's problem and develop a tissue-engineered vascular graft that's a small diameter. Well, I finished my Ph.D. in 2001, and I'm still working on that project. Okay, but what I did discover in looking at the cardiac environment was there's a lot of inflammation when you put stuff on the heart. And I started characterizing that. And I discovered that patients that have heart attacks or myocardial infarctions, there's ischemic tissue in the heart. And so I went a side direction and said, I'm not going to fix this problem right now because there's been a lot of smart people that haven't yet. And I have a grant with a collaborator in Tucson at the U of A on developing a tissue-engineered vascular graft. But again, well, we're like 15 years later, and we're still working on it, him and I. We weren't working on it together back then. Different people were. And then if you wind back from 2001, 30 years, there's been generations of scientists that have been working on it. So I'm not sure where we're going to solve it in my lifetime, but there's a lot of interesting questions around it. Where I went is this direction of, okay, patient has a heart attack. How do you actually prevent it from actually spreading and leading to bigger problems like congestive heart failure, which is what we'll look at today. So we're going to look at myocardial infarctions today. We're going to look at congestive heart failure. I'm not going to show you any of my research. This isn't like, oh great, it's going to be like, and I published in this science journal, and I published here. And, this isn't going to be one of those lectures. I'm just giving you a little background of why I like this topic so much. I've been doing it for a while, for about 20 years. I was in grad school for 5, so I finished in 01. That was about 15 years ago, plus another 5, so that's about 20 years. 20 years of thinking about cardiac problems, and I'm still doing that. Well, the direction that I went was a wound healing situation on the heart, and of course that led to other tissues that wound and heal, and that's like skin, so that's where the skin wound healing came from. So one of the questions that came up is, what kind of research are you going to be doing here? I'm going to be doing the research I've been doing ever since I started. A lot of cardiovascular research, not just on the heart, but also trying to design replacement stent grafts from different locations in the body. That's one thing I did for Gore when I went to work for Gore. And then wound healing in the skin. So the skin is an organ, and the cardiovascular system, blood vessels and heart, are my 2 big areas of interest. And where I'm guilty as a scientist is I'm very, very applied. And so almost at the risk of going too fast and saying, let's just put it in and see if it works. But I always want to know what's the impact. And then after I know that it's successful, then I'll back up and figure out why did it work, and I'll elucidate the mechanism. So that's kind of my process of doing things. You'll talk to a lot of other faculty that their research is more mechanistically driven at first, and they may never end up with an end result. It's just cool kind of figuring out how it all works. So there's many different ways to approach it. So today is pretty applied. We're going to talk like the whole semester has been. That's one of the reasons I like this class. And we're going to cover a number of topics throughout today's lecture. But first, what I want you to do is I want you kind of to pretend that you're an SI for 202. And I want you to draw a simplified diagram. I know there's at least 16 of you that will be able to do this, because 16 of you were in SI last night, and you drew out these things, okay? So draw out a picture of the heart simplistically and label the right ventricle, the left ventricle, the right atrium, and the left atrium. Okay? Go ahead and do that now. And if you're done with that, underneath it, why don't you define what preload is and what afterload is. This is all a review, but it's pretty important for a lot of the diseases we're going to talk about today. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page before we kind of move on. Compare and contrast preload and afterload. You guys doing? You done? Still working? Go ahead and put the valves in there if you're still working on this. I don't even have room for that. I'm just drawing a line to where they would be in your drawing. Okay? Valves. What kind of the major valves? If you're really accelerated, go ahead and write their names as well. What do you call them? Is this a little painful? No? Okay. That's right. Depends on how long ago 202 was. Well, I took 202 many years ago, so. And I can still remember it. Okay. Who's still drawing? Like, who's actually still working on this? Let's a little bit more time. Okay. One person. That's fine. We'll wait for the collective one. That's cool. All right. Good. Okay. So, what does your heart look like? How many of you honestly drew something that looks like this? Huh? Raise your hand. Come on. I want to see the romantics in the room. Yeah, you do, Greg. That's awesome. Really? That's so cute. Okay. So you can do it this way. That's actually pretty hard, eh? So you can do it that way. Another way that might be a little bit easier is, I'm going to see if I can figure out how to get this on here, out of the field of view, is what if you just represented it with 4 boxes? Okay? You can make it a little bit skewed. The ventricles at the bottom are a little bit bigger. Okay, well, you could still use this. You know, you could kind of do it like so. That's fine. Either way, you don't have to draw a new drawing. Now, if we did this, what would be in this upper left quadrant? Okay, so this is our right atrium, right? Because it's the patient's right side. And this is what? This is the right ventricle. And then what's up here? This is the left atrium. And this is the left ventricle. Okay. And what's in between the right atrium and the right ventricle with respect to a valve? Okay, it's an AV valve, and it's called what? The tricuspid. Right? In which direction does blood flow? It's going to be flowing from the atrium to the ventricle. Now, what brings blood into the right atrium? The superior and the inferior vena cava, correct? So the IVC and the SVC. Alright, so blood is flowing in this direction, and then it's flowing from the atrium into the right ventricle, and then it goes from here. Where does it go? What tissue does it go to? What tissue? Oh, lung. Brilliant. You guys are fantastic. It goes to the lung, and the vessel that takes it there is the pulmonary artery. Okay, arteries away. Now, the blood comes back in to the heart after it's oxygenated, and it comes into what structure over here? It comes into the left atrium, correct? So this is from the lungs, and it's coming this way, and this is the pulmonary vein. Very good. And then you have a valve here, and what valve is that? That's the bicuspid, also known as the mitral valve. Okay? This is all terminology that we need to rehash. And then from the left ventricle, which is really kind of the main working part of the heart, where does it go? To the aorta. And there's an important valve right here, which is called what? That's the aortic valve. Okay? So that blood flows through the heart. You guys remember that? Seems like you did pretty well on that. Now, if we call the left side of the heart really the working side of the heart, because that's where there's higher pressures. If you remember back to the Wiggers diagram and you look at the right side of the heart versus the left side of the heart, you'll see lower pressures on the right side and higher pressures on the left side. Now, when the heart, so the next question I asked you about was preload versus afterload. So who can define preload and or afterload? You just take one or both. Let's start with preload. What's preload? Pressure exerted from the system to the heart? No, that would be afterload. Okay? So preload is going to be on this side. Okay? Preload is basically the load that's on the heart before it contracts. Right? So it's dependent heavily on ventricular filling, or what we would call end diastolic volume. So preload happens over on the right side, and it's dependent upon end diastolic volume, or it's dependent upon what we call ventricular filling. So if you imagine as the heart is relaxed and blood is flowing in, it's going to fill up, right? As it fills up in relaxation or diastole, now that stretch is creating a load on the heart muscle itself. That's preload. It's loading the heart before you contract. Okay? Now, afterload is on this side of the heart. And afterload is what? It's the pressure that's exerted back on the heart from the system, or from the aorta, from the vasculature. And so afterload is the pressure that the heart has to work against in order to open up the aortic valve and allow for blood to flow out. You with me? So afterload can be described as a consequence of aortic pressure. And aortic pressure is determined by what we call mean arterial pressure, or blood pressure. So the factors that influence afterload are aortic pressure, or mean arterial pressure, which is also referred to as blood pressure. So let me use an example. If somebody is hypertensive, that means that they have high blood pressure, right? A hypertensive individual, true or false, will experience larger afterload values on the heart. True. So, another way of thinking about this, if somebody is hypertensive or has high blood pressure, does the heart have to work harder or less hard? It has to work harder, right? If you have a higher blood pressure. So that's one of the answers for today, is why, we're always saying, well, watch your blood pressure, Dad. How's your blood pressure doing, Grandpa? Well, blood pressure influences mean arterial pressure, which back influences aortic pressure, which causes a higher afterload on the heart. Okay? So these are the premises that we kind of need to understand. Back over here on preload, the other thing, there was this concept that you learned in 202 called the Frank-Starling law. You guys remember Frank-Starling? So Frank-Starling law of the heart is basically saying, on a beat-to-beat basis, if you increase ventricular filling, you increase preload, you ultimately, on that next heartbeat, you bring more blood in, the next heartbeat you're going to inject more blood out. So the Frank Starling law of the heart is if you increase preload, it actually leads to an increase in cardiac output. Cardiac output is a product of heart rate times stroke volume. Right? So it's the amount. Cardiac output is measured typically in liters or milliliters per minute. And the reason it's measured in milliliters or liters per minute is liters per minute, it's equal to heart rate, which is beats per minute, times stroke volume, which is liters per beat. And then the beats cancel, and you're left with liters per minute. You guys remember all this from 202? Okay, so we've got a couple of foundational principles. We've got blood flow that we understand. We now have connected the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart. So things that happen on the right side will influence things that happen on the left side. Likewise, the things that happen on the left side can influence things that happen on the right side. So, for example, if a patient has high blood pressure and they have to work harder to open up the aortic valve and push blood out, the left side of the heart is going to have to pump harder. So it's going to be exercising as cardiac muscle. Like every good striated cardiac or skeletal muscle, when it sees a load and it exercises, what does it do? It gets bigger. You get hypertrophy. So now you get this hypertrophic left side of the heart, okay? And that actually ends up backing up fluid to the lungs. As you back up fluid to the lungs, you increase pressure onto the right ventricle. What happens to preload? If there's a pressure head, it's going to go down, right? So you can increase preload over here to increase cardiac output here. But if cardiac output starts backing up because blood pressure is high, you ultimately aren't going to be bringing in as much blood to the right side of the heart. So that's the Frank Starling law of the heart, right? The right side mechanics influence the left side mechanics and vice versa. Okay, so a lot of the diseases that we're going to talk about today, as we look at the progression, rely very heavily on this premise that we're familiar with it. If we look at the classifications of diseases that we're going to talk about, the first one, shouldn't be a surprise, I've already alluded to it, is congestive heart failure. Then we'll move into arteriosclerosis. Then we'll look at ischemic heart disease, and valvular, pericardial, and congenital diseases. We're actually just not going to have time to get to all 6 of these topics. We're going to cover 3 in great detail. If you read the text, you covered a lot more. The pre-quiz, the post-quiz will cover a lot more than just these 3. But these are the ones that we're going to have time to cover in detail that I'm going to feel comfortable about, so you guys can focus your study. And that's the whole concept, is exposure to a broad amount of material in the readings and even in the quizzes, pre and post. And then in the lecture, we really try to hone in on, okay, what's he going to ask on the exam? So from a fairness standpoint, trying to focus your studying so it's not like I could ask you anything, okay? And I'll ask you questions about the content in the lecture. Here's a probably better diagram than our 2 up here, because this person has some skills, and I don't necessarily have those kinds of skills. I have other skills, but not those. So if we look at congestive heart failure first up on the list, congestive heart failure is usually considered to be a systolic issue. So systole is when the heart is contracting, diastole when it's relaxing. So a systolic issue is usually an issue with the contraction phase. In congestive heart failure, what's happening is the heart cannot pump at an adequate rate. It's not able to output enough blood. Cardiac output goes down in congestive heart failure. And as cardiac output goes down, there's backup that happens, and the backup happens into the lungs. So it's very, very common for there to be a decrease in cardiac output, which is what we call a forward failure, because you're not able to move the blood forward in the process. And where does it back up? It backs up in the lung. The fluid backs up in the lungs. And as you have bloods backing up in the lungs, you're going to have an increase in water content in the lungs. And that's going to seep out and cause edema into the surrounding tissues. And that's where you get this congestion. That's why it's called congestive heart failure. Is patients who are in CHF have a lot of fluid that is sitting in the pleural space. And it's actually putting pressure on the heart. And that's why these patients complain of, it's very difficult to take a deep breath. It's very difficult to inhale and breathe normally. I have shortness of breath, and I feel like there's just a lot of pressure on my chest. And that's from this congestive backup that takes place. Now, there's two causes or etiologies that are listed on this slide. We already talked about one of them, which is an abnormal load. This abnormal load, you can write over here, that's hypertension. An increase in mean arterial pressure would be an abnormal load, right? So it's like the heart's weightlifting. So that increase in an abnormal load, as the heart is trying to beat against a larger pressure head, that's another way of saying that afterload is high due to hypertensive status. That causes a backup of fluid at the level of the aortic valve. That fluid ultimately gets pushed back into the lungs after the congestion lies. So we talked about that one. The other problem that could happen is what we call endocarditis. Endocarditis is this inner lining of the heart, which is the endocardium, right? And all of these structures have endocardium inside of them. That endocardium can actually have a disease known as endocarditis, which is an inflammatory disease. And it causes irritation in the lining of the heart. And one of the clinical outcomes of endocarditis can be a backup of fluid into the lungs. Backup of fluid in the lungs because the heart itself, that endocardial layer, is in close proximity to the myocardium. So the endocarditis spreads to the myocardium, called myocarditis, and now the heart doesn't pump as effectively. And as it doesn't eject the blood as effectively, the blood starts to pool, and it gets kind of trapped within the cardiac cycle, and it's not being ejected on every heartbeat like it's supposed to. So two main causes of congestive heart failure. But the problem is typically a forward failure where the blood is not moving forward through this vascular network. Well, the good news is the heart actually tries to compensate. You and I have compensatory mechanisms that are built in. That means that we're going to do things to account for these changes so that we don't have deleterious long-term effects. And there's three compensation mechanisms that I want to go over. There's three compensation mechanisms. The first one is called the norepinephrine release. So as the contractility, or as the heart itself moves into congestive heart failure, norepinephrine as a sympathomimetic can be released, and it can actually increase the contractility of the heart. What that word means is, on every heartbeat, it contracts more forcefully. Right? So all of us could clap. Let's clap our hands quietly. Okay? At about this rate. Okay? So this is probably about the rate. You guys are musically challenged. You can't keep this rhythm. Let's try to get this rhythm. Ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. I feel like I'm a music teacher. 1 and 2, 3. That would be that's what my music is. 1 and 2. Right? Alright, let's do it. Sorry, I got sidetracked, right? I've never done this exercise before, so let's try this. No resting. And we're just going to keep a regular rhythm. There's no one hand, okay? 1, 2, 3. So this is our contractility. This is probably a little faster right now, but maybe you're a little excited that we're doing this clapping. Okay? So if we wanted to increase the contractility, we're not increasing the rate. What would that look like? Right. Right, now slow that down so we can hear me. So that was just an increase in contractility, not a change in rate. So norepinephrine will increase the forcefulness of every contraction. Okay? Make sense? Well, the problem that eventually happens is that forceful increase in contraction will actually cause an increase in vascular resistance at the level of the periphery. So if you increase vascular resistance within the periphery, because norepinephrine, it causes an increase in contractility, right, symptomatic, it also causes constriction of the vessel walls a little bit. And that slight vasoconstriction will increase total peripheral resistance, right? So total peripheral resistance, if you increase TPR, total peripheral resistance, then you decrease preload. You decrease ventricular filling because you don't bring back as much blood. So over time, that increase in total peripheral resistance ultimately is a bad thing. Because if you bring less blood back to the heart with a higher vascular resistance, then on the next heart cycle, you have less blood to eject out. Okay? So number one mechanism, increasing norepinephrine release, it's a short-term solution with long-term problems. What do I mean by short-term? Well, days to months, and then the long-term problems will be months to years down the road. Okay? Next up, renin-angiotensin. So the renin-angiotensin system, right? Within this system, if you guys remember, there's an enzyme known as angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE. And this takes angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 increases your thirst response, right? And it increases antidiuretic hormone. And ADH, or vasopressin, has activity at the kidneys to conserve water and prevent you from urinating the water. So your idea is to bring in more water because you're thirsty and don't urinate out as much fluid. The whole idea is to increase the amount of blood volume that's in your system so that you can put more blood back into the preload side. So on the next heart cycle, you can eject out more cardiac output. Make sense? So your body says, okay, the norepinephrine worked for a little while. Now I'm going to move to plan B, which is I'm going to conserve water. I've increased my blood volume. And that means I'll put more blood back into the heart, and on the next heartbeat I'll get more blood out, because that's the Frank Starling law of the heart. Well, again, this only lasts for so long. Because if the heart is actually compromised, if you do that in the next months to years, you're increasing the load that the heart is actually working on. And so these two initial mechanisms cause long-term problems, both of these. Short-term gains for long-term problems. Now the third one is the only mechanism that actually provides any long-term benefit. In the right atrium, there's a compound that is released, and it's called atrial natriuretic peptide. Atrial natriuretic peptide. And what ANP does is it stimulates two activities. Diuresis, which is increasing urination, and then also natriuresis, which is excreting more sodium into the urine. Which, if there's more sodium in the urine, then the water is going to follow via osmosis, and that's going to ultimately lead to additional diuresis. And so atrial natriuretic peptide starts pushing more water and lowering your blood volume. It's a diuretic. It makes you pee and lower your blood volume. So what you do is you say, all right, well, I increased my blood volume last time, and now my heart's even worse off. Now what I'm going to do is if I lower my blood volume, I will lower blood pressure, and then I'll have less of a pressure head for the heart to work against. And this is actually the last mechanism, which is actually one of the better ones that we have naturally. It's also the first strategy to treat a patient in congestive heart failure, is you provide them with diuretics. And so a patient has congestive heart failure, you actually give them diuretics to make them pee more, lowering their blood volume, lowering their mean arterial pressure. And so the patients will say almost immediately with diuretics on board, they're more aggressive than A&P. They'll say, you know, gosh, I have this tremendous relief. I lay down at night and I can fall asleep because it doesn't feel so congested. But the problem is I get up every 2 hours to go pee. Okay, so now their frustration is I still can't get a good night's sleep because I got to go pee every 2 hours. Okay? So this is how the heart is compensating for heart failure. Well, for a while, this Frank Starling trade-off will work. So the patient starts developing symptoms of heart failure, and then the first mechanism kicks in, and then it takes them for a little while. Then the second mechanism kicks in, takes them for a little while. Then the third mechanism kicks in, takes them for a little while. So it might be 10 years later, the patient has compensated, okay, and then it was decompensated because of this Frank Starling right side influences left side and vice versa. And then ultimately they progress to a point where they start developing symptoms of heart failure because there aren't any other mechanisms to alleviate these problems. And in heart failure, one of the biggest symptoms that we see is this idea of cardiac captcha. So patients that are in chronic heart failure, it's like they're exercising all the time because their heart is actually working harder than it normally needs to because of this increased load. And so they're burning more energy than they normally would. And by burning more energy than they normally would, they're using more calories. And so they get this sort of body wasting type of disease, which is what cardiac captcha is. They have severe weight loss over time because they don't have enough caloric intake to support how hard their heart is actually working. Now, if we further discriminate between the different types of heart failure, I want to characterize left versus right-sided. And so we broadly talked about heart failure. Now we're going to talk about the left side, and we're going to talk about the right side. So the left side of heart failure is typically where it starts. Because it's most common to have a problem with blood pressure or hypertensiveness. That puts a load on the heart. That extra load on the heart makes a hypertrophic response as the heart enlarges to try to accommodate that, pushes more blood out. Then the heart releases norepinephrine over the next months to maybe a couple of years. That increases the forcefulness, the contractility of the heartbeat. Then the heart moves into leveraging vasopressin, right? The angiotensin converting enzyme mechanism, and it conserves water, and that leads to increase in preload for a while. And then that fades off, and the heart actually gets, or the body gets rid of the extra fluid. Well, after that 10-year cycle, and that's usually about what it takes about 10 years, now the patient is developing signs of heart failure, and the morphology that we see at the bottom here is we get cardiac hypertrophy, which is the left side. We get a blown out, dilated ventricle. It's really, really big. Okay? And then we get pulmonary congestion and edema, like I was just talking about. So our biggest impact is on the pulmonary circuit, and that's that heavy pressure that they feel in their lungs or on their chest. And so the way that we treat that is with excessive diuretics, like we just said. Now, hypertension isn't the only cause. So here's systemic hypertension. It's one of the more common ones, especially in our society. But we also have either mitral or aortic valve disease. So if the aortic valve right here is bad, and it isn't keeping a good seal, and it's leaky, then there's not a, it's like there's a drafty door in your house, an external door in your house in the middle of winter. You notice that on the next month's heating bill. You're like, what? What's going on? And you start walking around checking doors and windows, and you see that there is a giant leak right here. So also the mitral valve, or the bicuspid. between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Because this is a high pressure system on the left side, these two valves are the ones that typically wear out first, because they're the ones that are actually seeing the highest pressures. So when we have valve replacements, it's usually the mitral valve or the aortic valve. Those are the most common valves to be replaced, because they're on the high pressure side. So if those valves are bad, that could actually lead to left-sided heart failure. Ischemic heart disease. Ischemic heart disease, like I told you in the intro, was something that I was looking at in grad school and still am. But if a patient has a coronary vessel that is blocked and clogged and blood flow to the distal portion of the myocardium is compromised, that part of the heart then becomes ischemic and non-functional. Well, now it actually can't contribute. And as it can't contribute, it's causing additional load on the surrounding tissue because it's having to compensate for the area of the heart that's actually no longer working. So that's how ischemic heart disease can play into it. And then the last one on the list is this primary myocardial disease. This would be a genetic defect or a genetic abnormality in the way the heart was developed. Okay, and there's a whole list of those. But patients that have a myocardial disease, a genetic inherited myocardial disease, may develop and likely will develop some type of heart failure later in life. Okay? Now, the next one up is right-sided. So that's on the left side of the heart. Now, on the right side of the heart, oops, sorry, symptoms. I forgot the symptoms slide. On the symptoms, we're going to get shortness of breath, a cough, shortness of breath when they're lying down. Tachycardia is what? Rapid heart rate. Okay? And the reason the rapid heart rate is this formula right here, that the cardiac output is equivalent to heart rate times stroke volume. So if you want to increase cardiac output, you can either increase the heart rate or you can increase stroke volume. Right? So if you increase heart rate, you just beat a little bit faster. On a minute-by-minute basis, you're effectively going to be putting out more blood. Mitral valve regurgitation, these are symptoms as well. And then atrial fib, because the heart is actually starting to skip its electrical beats as it tries to rapidly compensate for the decrease in cardiac output. So these are left-sided heart failure symptoms. And if we move on in this patient and they develop left-sided heart failure, it's very common for that to ultimately lead to right-sided heart failure. So the most common cause of right-sided heart failure, right CHF, is left-sided heart failure with pulmonary congestion. So when this backs up, and it ultimately backs up to the lungs, the fluid sits in the lungs. Well, as it backs up to the lungs, now it's putting extra pressure on the right ventricle. So the right ventricle is now seeing effectively a pulmonary afterload, because the edema in the respiratory tree is the pressure head now that the right side has to work against. So the most common cause of right-sided heart failure is going to be left-sided heart failure as it made it to the lungs. Some other common cause, or other causes not as common, if you have an underlying parenchymal disease of the lung, like a tuberculosis, you might see right-sided heart failure without any left-sided symptoms. You could have a lung-specific vascular disease, right? You could have, for example, like a pulmonary embolism. A pulmonary embolism, PE is not a good thing, right? So somebody mouth, that's bad. It's very bad, actually can kill you, right? So if you have an embolism in the vascular tree, and on the venous side, right, that embolism is going to ultimately make it to the right side. And as it makes it to the right side, a lot of times it'll get stuck in the lungs, and you have a PE in the lungs. Well, if it sits in the lungs, now it becomes a pressure gradient, or a head, that the right side has to work against. And that's why we're so worried about pulmonary embolisms. Okay, you say so-and-so had a pulmonary embolism. Where is it? It's in the heart. Oh, geez, you know, it's probably ultimately going to make it to the lungs. And now the heart's going to actually be working against it. Okay? So the biggest impact of left-sided, the one we just looked at, was on the lungs. But the biggest impact of right side is actually backwards on the systemic circuit. So it's backwards through the IVC, and you're going to see things like congestion within the liver, in the portal network. That's what hepatomegaly means. Congestive liver disease, right? You have a congestion, liver enlargement. That's what liver. Hepato is liver, and the megaly is enlargement, or abnormal size. That's what it really means. You'll have pleural effusions around the pleural spaces, and you'll get a lot of peripheral edema in the systemic tree because you're not encouraging venous return. It's actually getting pooled and stuck out in the periphery. So that's our biggest impact on the from right-sided congestive heart failure. Okay? Now there's another terminology in the literature. So it's congestive heart failure, CHF. Well, CHF is also referred to as what? Chronic heart failure. So two different terminologies, the same nomenclature. They're talking about two different aspects of the disease. CHF, congestive heart failure, is saying we're kind of highlighting, talking about the congestion that takes place either within the lungs or on the systemic circuit. And then CHF, chronic heart failure, saying usually it doesn't happen. Someone doesn't have a heart attack, and then the next day they have chronic heart failure. Chronic means that the heart is actually getting worse or deteriorating over a long period of time, usually years to like 10 years or beyond. Okay? And it's not uncommon for patients that have high blood pressure for like the last 15 to 20 years, and it's been unmanaged because they're not very great about watching salt in their diet, or watching their weight, or exercising, or taking their blood pressure meds, and then they start developing these signs of heart failure. Okay? So the question that I have for you is this one, before we switch into our second disease that we'll look at today. Left-sided heart failure may lead to right-sided heart failure as a result of or owing to what? Excessive volume retention, poor perfusion on the right coronary, an increased right ventricular afterload, or arterial hypotension. How many of you say A? How many of you say B? How many of you say C and D? And C is what happened. Nicely done. Increased right ventricular afterload. Okay, our second disease that I wanted to characterize, so that was congestive heart failure or chronic heart failure. The second one is arteriosclerosis. Arteriosclerosis, where we're looking at different disease etiologies within the vasculature. And why this is important is it's kind of one of the -- issues that we see within the United States right now. As we see within the westernized world, actually, is an increase in vascular disease of the blood vessels that's all over the body. And the problem here is we're kind of focused on the heart today, but we're focused on the heart and the cardiovascular system, the vascular network. Well, that vascular network also perfuses the brain. And so if you have global arteriosclerosis, the most common subset of that being atherosclerosis, we'll talk about that, then you're going to get lesions all throughout the body. When you get the lesions in the carotid arteries or in some of the smaller, finer vessels of the circle of Willis that perfuse the brain itself, then you have the opportunity for a stroke to take place. Okay, so our cardiovascular health actually directly impacts our what we call neurovascular health, or the vessels that perfuse the brain that can actually lead to neural problems. Because our number one neural problem right now is actually stroke. So we look at arteriosclerosis. This is a family of diseases that's referring to what happens at the level of the blood vessel. What happens at the level of the blood vessel as it becomes damaged and diseased. Damaged and diseased. And so it has to have that sort of dual pathway. It has to have a damage to take place, and then a long-term disease that's going to allow for things to progress or to get worse. So if we look at this slide, some vascular biology for you in panel A. This is a cross-sectional view through a typical artery. And you see on the inner lining, which is this layer known as the tunica intima. All right, tunica intima. Tunic is like a layer or a coat. So this is the layer, the intimal layer, which is a single layer of endothelial cells. And we talked about that tunica intima, or that endothelial layer, in the very beginning of the semester when we started talking about inflammation. And we said that those endothelial cells form these tight junction barriers, but then they can separate apart to allow for cells to migrate through. And those cells, if it was an inflammatory response, the first cells that migrate through would be which ones? Neutrophils. Look at that. You already know the answer to that for next week, and you didn't really do any studying. Okay? That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Now, the second responder that would come through that endothelial monolayer would be what cell type? Macrophages. Look at that. Look out. You just learned something this semester, and you remembered it. Even well beyond the exam, okay? So that makes me really happy. Now, if you can email me in a year from now and give me that same answer, you will make my day, okay? All right, so now we remember back to the tunica intima. We've seen this before, even this semester. We also know from 202 that there was this medial layer, which is smooth muscle cells. Because the blood vessels, the arteries actually can contract or they can dilate, right? We talked about vasodilation and vasoconstriction when we were talking about the recruitment of these inflammatory cells, and we're looking at various aspects of blood flow. So that's the tunica medial layer. And there's a elastin layer that separates this inner layer from the middle layer, known as the internal elastic lamina. And then that's that dotted blue line. And then there's another elastin layer, which is this external elastic lamina that separates the medial layer from the adventitial layer. The adventitial layer is this outer covering. So we have kind of our three linings. Well, what happens here when the blood vessel on the inside lining gets damaged, or what would cause damage to the endothelium? Hypertension is one. Right? If you have a hose, right? If you have a hose in the backyard, and it's old and it's got cracks in it, right? And then you turn on the pressure, what happens? There's a crack right there in space. You see like a little bulge coming out, right? So we know that high pressure can cause damage. Some of those cracking on the garden hose is probably from the sun, more so than the constant use of the pressure. But even over time, that garden hose under constant pressure will wear out. In fact, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but plumbers will tell you that you're supposed to pay attention to your water pressure at your house. Are you guys familiar with this? Because the city, whatever city you live in, they're trying to supply water to neighborhoods. So they have to pressurize the water. And as it gets to your neighborhood, it's going to, 200 homes, 30 homes, 12 homes. It's not usually going to one. And so they have to have high pressure to get it ultimately to when you turn on the bathroom faucet, it comes out fast enough where you're not like, oh my gosh, drip, 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 right? It's like, I just want to brush my teeth, right? It's going to take me like 5 minutes to get my toothbrush wet. So a lot of times the pressure at your house is either too low or too high, and so you're supposed to pay attention to it. And what plumbers will tell you, if you have chronic high pressure within your inflow to your house, you actually could prematurely wear out your pipes in your home. And then you're going to get leaks in various places that you didn't even know about until they start puddling. So it's kind of the same analogy. Right? Vascular biology is not very different than plumbing. Okay? It's pretty much the same thing. They're tubes, they carry fluid, okay, and they're pressurized. So we know from our former colleagues, we know that high pressure within the pipes can cause premature wear out of those pipes and leaks. And that's exactly what happens here. So hypertension can cause damage. And once the damage takes place, a lot of the process that we see is very similar to many other types of tissue where we have healing. We're going to encourage inflammation. Right? We're going to recruit cells we're going to lay down new matrix. Well, the problem is, if this is the blood vessel and that lesion is here, it doesn't just heal and stop. It heals and kind of continues to grow. And the reason for that is what these smooth muscle cells do. So when the damage takes place and the smooth muscle cells migrate out of this internal elastic lamina, they move into this proliferation phase where they divide out of control. They're quiescent, meaning a term that says they don't divide when they're bordered by the internal and the external elastic lamina. And that endothelial monolayer kind of keeps them in check. They're like right here, and the smooth muscle cells are back there. They're like, just quiet down back there. It's like what you do, what I do in my car when I'm driving, right? Because like the kids will take off their seatbelts, like, you're not allowed up here. It's like against the law, okay? Get back. So you're holding them back, but as soon as my wife or I are distracted, like somebody's in the front seat, like, oh, let's watch this movie. Like, you can't do that. So the endothelial cells hold back the smooth muscle. As soon as the endothelium has a breach point, the smooth muscle cells migrate out, and then they proliferate. It's like going from 4 kids to 8 to 6. I mean, that would be like ridiculous. Okay? So this border controls where these smooth muscle cells sit. The smooth muscle cells, once they see a lesion, they move in. They're allowed to proliferate. That's the mitosis. That's another word for it. And they start manufacturing new extracellular matrix. That causes that intimal layer to thicken. As it thickens, the lumen does this. The lumen gets smaller as the intima thickens. It doesn't thicken and go like this way. It thickens and it actually narrows the lumen over time. And the smooth muscle cells that actually proliferate after the development process, like in this pathology process, they don't behave like normal smooth muscle cells. So they don't actually even contract. They're not contractile. So you can't stimulate them to vasodilate and say, okay, that's great, there's more smooth muscle cells, now let's vasodilate it. They actually won't respond. They're non-responsive. They're a pathological type of smooth muscle cell phenotype that's not helpful to the lumen of the blood vessel. Furthermore, because they take over where the endothelium were, you lose the antithrombogenic capability. Because the antithrombogenic capability is found in the endothelium. It's not found in the smooth muscle. So this pathological stage, you're getting the wrong cell type into the intima. It proliferates and grows, narrowing the lumen. It doesn't actually have any contractile or responsive properties like it normally would. And what the cell was that should have been there as an endothelial cell is gone. And so your antithrombogenic properties are missing as well. This is what happens when a blood vessel is actually damaged. So if we take a peek at the 2 different types, we've got arteriosclerosis, which is defined as an abnormal thickening and hardening of the vessels, and the lumen actually narrows over time. Our subtypes, and there's very subtle differences here, but I want you to notice the spelling differences. The first type that's really targets and primarily found in small arterioles and small arteries is arteriolosclerosis. And this is the one that you see associated with hypertension. Hypertension is usually systemic, it's everywhere, and so it's going to impact all of the vasculature. The one that is most common, though, is actually atherosclerosis, where you actually get an atheroma. And with atherosclerosis, that's the A-T-H-E-R-O versus arteriolo, which is A-R-T-E-R-I-O. Think of the word atheroma. The atheroma is actually a lesion. It's a lesion that has scar tissue, fibrosis. It has foam cells, which are macrophages because they're there. It's an inflammatory response. And those macrophages see cholesterol and lipid. Why do they see cholesterol and lipid? Because we consume a lot of that in our diet. and it's floating around in the bloodstream. And when that vessel wall is damaged, the macrophages that are there are gobbling up all of the cholesterol and lipid that's within that tissue, creating what's called a foam cell. And that's cholesterol and lipid within a macrophage. And I'll show you some histology here in a minute. The atheroma that takes place also has the ability to grow out of control to a point where the middle of it becomes necrotic because it's even too far away from the blood supply. And think about that, the blood supply is like right there because it's in the wall of the blood vessel. But it gets so thick that the middle of it becomes necrotic. Now, as it develops, it actually will harden because it collects calcium within that atheroma. The word atheroma translates to gruel. That's the translation term, is gruel. So this atheroma has inflammation, it has fibrosis and collagen, it has macrophages because of the inflammation. They see cholesterol and lipid and they consume it, they phagocytose it. There's calcium deposits that take place, and now it actually starts to harden. We've done a couple of studies in the lab where we've received cadaveric tissue from donors. And these are patients that donated their body to science. And so we'll ask for certain vessels. And the vessels that we have asked for are a lot of peripheral vessels because we're trying to characterize what happens with the hardening of these vessels, this atherosclerosis with this atheroma. If we want to develop technologies where as time progresses, this atheroma grows, the lumen shuts down, then there are technologies called crossing catheters. We'll come in from a leg vessel and we'll find with a wire, we'll find the lumen and we'll access the wire and fish it through. Then we bring the catheter over the wire, the guide wire, put it in place, and with energy, either mechanical energy like drilling, or with laser energy or heat, or radio frequency generating heat, we'll blast open that vessel. Well, you need to know what you're dealing with. What are we trying to tunnel through if it's a mechanical device? If you're an engineer, a bioengineer trying to develop a mechanical roto-rooter type of device, the question is, what am I drilling through? Is it hard like wood? Or is it hard like stone? Or concrete? Or rock? So I don't know if any of you have done any drilling in your life, but there are different types of drill bits, right? You don't just go to Home Depot and say, I need to buy a drill bit. And it's sweet, what kind of bit do you want? Like one that goes through stuff. Well, what are you drilling through? Everything. Well, do you want to drill through wood? Yeah, that'd be good. Well, what about stone? Yeah, that too. Or you're going to need a different type of drill bit to get through wood versus stone or concrete. Okay? So we were trying to figure out the hardness. That's how hard is that material. So we were getting these samples, and then we were doing this nano indentation where you put a pressure on, you fillet open the vessel. First off, we took the vessel with a razor blade and we went like this, right? And the razor blade goes like halfway through. You look at the razor blade, and the edge of the razor blade looked like this, and it used to look like that. That's all the calcium. So to cut a vessel about like that and fillet it open longitudinally so we could lay it out like a rectangle, and then we have a nice luminal surface where we could nano indent, we had to use about 3 to 4 razor blades for about a 6-inch segment. Okay? And every time it was like cutting stone. It sounded exactly like we were cutting through stone. And that's what we were all like, oh my gosh, this is rough. And I knew this, but I never played with these vessels before. I knew it got hard, but I never knew that they were like stone. And so then we had these samples processed, and the way that we designed it was we benchmarked it to known values in the literature. And so we got, do you guys know what pumice stone is? Pumice stone is it's like what you would do to like scrub your heels or clean your fingers after you're working on the car or something like that. It's basically like a sandstone-like looking structure, but it's very, very hard. So we use pumice stone. We use chalk. Well, there's no chalk in here. You guys remember in the old days what chalk looks like? So chalk, pumice stone, and then we used a ceramic, like a tile. Like I don't even think that's real ceramic, but some of you have nice homes that actually have real tile in it. So we had a tile, a pumice stone, and chalk, right? And the pumice stone was in between. The ceramic tile was the hardest, pumice stone was the middle, chalk was really the softest, okay? And we thought it would be somewhere near chalk or pumice stone. It was in between pumice stone and the tile. That's the hardness of these vessels when you open them up. These are from like 78-year-old patients that have passed away, right? Pretty crazy stuff. That's how hard this atheroma gets. So what happens pathogenically? Well, step 1, step 2, step 3. The pathogenesis of atherosclerosis with the atheroma, that's the one that we're talking about because that's the one that's actually most common. It has to start initially with some sort of chronic endothelial injury. That means that the endothelium are seeing some insult long-term over time, chronic. Number 2 on the list is hypertension. You see that? And that's kind of one of our biggest issues in this country. Well, you combine that with the first one of hyperlipidemia, where our blood itself has too much lipid flowing in it. That also seems to happen in the Western world and be very closely associated with hypertension. And hyperlipidemia, why is that? Well, the blood, now if you imagine a pump, okay? Imagine a pump. And if you're pumping through that system, here's the example, better example. Imagine a straw about that diameter, kind of like a McDonald's straw, okay? And you're sipping water, okay? Comes up pretty easily. Now imagine that the liquid inside becomes more viscous. Like, for example, you add more sugar to it. And now all of a sudden it's like, maybe like maple syrup. Then think about the next step, which is like a milkshake, right? You know when you're trying to drink a milkshake through a straw and you're like, right? Your head's about to... So if you increase the viscosity of the blood, the pump that I'm describing is just your vacuum in your mouth through a straw. But if the pump is your heart and the viscosity of the blood increases, and you do this for 35, 40 years, right? The heart is working harder, and the blood vessels are seeing increased stress, frictional force. So hyperlipidemia, or too much fat in our blood, can be a problem. Hypertension, smoking, right? This is a blood disorder. You have abnormal hemodynamic factors within the heart. Certain types of viruses or toxins that target the endothelial cells, or even a lot of immune-type reactions where you're stimulating global inflammation. You get vascular diseases. And we saw some of that, right? We saw vasculitis is one of our problems with one of our hypersensitivities. Do you guys remember that? Vasculitis, we had glomerulonephritis, and then we had reactive arthritis that took place as a result of an immune problem when we looked at our hypersensitivity, which was type what? Huh? Type 3. Very good. Okay? So we're kind of tying a lot of these concepts together. So you have this endothelial injury that takes place, and now you have dysfunction of the endothelium because they're damaged. They're no longer going to be working the way they're supposed to work. That increases the permeability and allows for these inflammatory mediators to move. They move into the wall of the blood vessel, and that's where the problem happens. You have macrophages taking residence, and you get a lot of this lipoprotein and cholesterol accumulation because it's found in the blood. As it's found in the blood, right, you start recruiting monocytes to become macrophages. Those macrophages are capable of creating free radicals within that tissue. Those free radicals find low-density lipoprotein. Low-density lipoprotein, this is a molecule that encourages cholesterol to be readily available in the bloodstream. LDL is considered the bad cholesterol. You guys remember this? So LDL is the bad cholesterol. It's a lipoprotein that encourages the availability of cholesterol in the blood. So LDL is necessary like during growth spurts in adolescence. Because if you want to make new tissue, you need cholesterol available to build a new cell wall. Remember, cholesterol is found in the membrane of the cell. But in you and I, we just need enough cholesterol to repair cells as they turn over. You know, it's not like we're going to be growing another 6 inches in the next year. We're all done with that growth spurt. Okay? And so the LDL needs have gone way down. And now we're in this phase where HDL, high-density lipoprotein, this encourages cholesterol to move back to the liver and move out of the bloodstream. So if you have a diet that's high in LDL and low in HDL, then you make cholesterol and lipoprotein readily available in the bloodstream. And as it's readily available in the bloodstream, if it finds a lesion and the macrophages see it, they're going to ingest it, and that's going to make a foam cell. And those foam cells get stuck there. They cannot go anyplace because they're so full of cholesterol and fat. And that kind of creates that little lesion. You get platelet adhesion that takes place as well. And then you get more smooth muscle cell recruitment and proliferation. And all of this builds upon the lipid that is stacking up. Lipid accumulation on top of each other. So a picture that shows this in sequence. Here's a normal blood vessel on the left, and this is a diseased blood vessel on the right. Okay? This road marker or reference point is our internal elastic membrane. And so the smooth muscles should be down here in the medial layer. And you can see in the disease state, they start migrating into this area where there is inflammation. You see a picture of the macrophages taking up the lipid, becoming foam cells that get trapped here. You see that the smooth muscle cells that proliferate and grow within here start making additional extracellular matrix. That actually grows the thickness of that wall, creating a necrotic center and shrinking the lumen size. Now, this disease that's here, we have a name for it. Atheroma, or a plaque, or atherosclerotic lesion. All of those terminologies are referring to the exact same thing, which is the result of this inflammatory disease, all starting with damage to the endothelial lining. Okay? The plaque itself can either be stable or unstable. So stable or unstable means that if it's stable, it's fine for now, it's not going to do anything. If it's unstable, it's compromised mechanically, and we're worried about it rupturing. If it ruptures, you have a situation known as a gangrenous. In addition to that, within this fibrous plaque, we see C-reactive protein levels go up. C-reactive protein is a protein that accumulates in response to inflammation. So as inflammatory levels go up, C-reactive protein levels go up. And what C-reactive protein does is it helps to activate or stimulate the complement system. And the complement system, if you go back to inflammation, is going to complement, right, the recruitment of inflammatory cells and certain mediators. So this is our disease state that we have. Now, what does it look like histologically? What it looks like histologically is shown on this particular picture. And what I want to point out, and this will be our last slide, we'll take a break. What I want to point out is this is the lumen right here on the left. This is a trichrome image. The lumen should have circumscribe this whole structure. You with me? So now the lumen has shrunk to just this size. And when you look at this, if you were doing this under imaging techniques, you would say, okay, this vessel is diseased. It has about 65% narrowing. Right? It means it's only open. It's less than 30%, right? It's about 35% open, 65% closed. Okay? So we have 65% narrowing, or a stenosis that left a lumen that's only 35% open. Now, if we zoom in and we use some slightly different histology, the picture in the middle, the B picture, is highlighting the internal elastic lamina right here. See this squiggly line? This is the internal elastic lamina, which should have on top of it just a single layer of cells. Well, does that look like a single layer of cells anywhere? No. Right? So this is our internal elastic lamina. That's a zoom in of about right here. That's like about right here. Oh wait, no, sorry. It's about right here. You can see how this little, see that little angle right there? It's about right here. And of course, this F is labeling the fibrous cap that's surrounding the inflammation. And then the necrotic core is labeled C. So here's our necrotic core. So this fibrous tissue right here, is actually being stained with a marker for lipid. So within the fiber, that's all the yellow. So that's this right here, but stained with the yellow marker. And where we are in this picture is right about right here. Okay? Then in our last picture on panel C, on the far, far right side, we see two things. We see neovascularization and we see calcification. The calcification are the arrowheads. So the arrowheads, this structure right here and this structure right here, are calcium deposits that are leading to that razor blade result that I was telling you about when we tried to cut through them. And because it's growing so big, in order to try to prevent the necrotic core from forming, the arrows with the tails, the arrows are showing the development of new blood vessels. Where are we here? We're actually, this is the necrotic core right here, which is like right here. So we're right in this region right here. We're outside of the necrotic core trying to create a new vasculature to keep this tissue alive. Okay? So that's the disease that we're up against. Now, I'm going to tell you after the break a little bit of the outcomes, what happens. And then the good news is I'm going to show you a couple of videos about how we treat. Okay? How we treat. Not just don't eat McDonald's every day, okay? But if you do have the occasional McDonald's and you're 85 years of age, you're going to find vessels all over your body that look like this. It's just part of the process of being human. Okay? And there's a huge genetic component to it. Just because you're super, super healthy and you don't eat a lot of fast food doesn't mean you're not going to have these lesions. Right? We see the healthiest lifestyle patients ending up with atherosclerotic lesions because it runs in their family. Okay? And they're susceptible to endothelial damage out of the environment or the elements. Okay? And as they get older, that endothelial layer is compromised and then there's a lesion that forms. Okay? So we'll talk about what happens. I already kind of mentioned one, which was aneurysm, but there are some other problems that take place that kind of lead us to our last little segment when we come back. All right, we'll take a break.